The morning of her wedding, Arabella Sinclair stood before the mirror in her borrowed dressing room and told herself the worst was over. She had survived 7 years of carefully chosen words, 7 years of watching every door she entered, every name she gave, every smile she allowed. She had built herself from nothing, from a lie, if one wanted to be precise about it, and she had built it well. No cracks, no loose threads. No one had ever looked at her and seen anything other than what she intended them to see. In 1 hour, she would become the Duchess of Ashford. She pressed her hands flat against the vanity and breathed. She did not know that downstairs, a letter had just arrived. She did not know whose hand had written it, or how long it had been in the making, or how many people had been paid to ensure it reached the Duke before the bells rang. She did not know that the man she loved was, at that very moment, standing in the study with the door locked, reading her name, her real name, for the first time in his life. She only knew that the roses in her bouquet smelled too sweet, and that her hands would not stop trembling, and that somewhere beneath the silk and the pearls and the careful architecture of the woman she had become, the girl she used to be was very, very afraid. She arrived in London on a Tuesday in October, which was, as any society matron would tell you, entirely the wrong time to arrive if one wished to be noticed. The season was over. The grand houses had emptied. The ladies who mattered had retreated to their country estates with their daughters, and their ambitions packed neatly alongside the good china. London in October was for merchants, second sons, and people with nowhere better to be. Arabella Sinclair had nowhere better to be, but she was not about to let anyone know that. She stepped down from the hired coach with the posture of a woman who had arrived precisely when she intended, looked at the modest townhouse on Wentworth Street with the expression of someone merely tolerating it, and instructed the driver to take her trunk to the side entrance. Not the back, the side. Details she had learned were everything. The townhouse belonged to her mother's second cousin, a man named Gerald Fitch, who owed Arabella's mother a debt so old and so complicated that he had stopped questioning it years ago. He was a quiet, nearsighted widower with 3 cats and no interest in society, which made him, in Arabella's estimation, the most useful man in England. He asked no questions. He introduced her when asked as his late wife's niece from Shropshire. He forgot, conveniently and consistently, to mention anything further. Arabella did the rest herself. It was not so difficult in the beginning. She had grown up watching her mother perform, watching how a woman could walk into a room and make every person in it believe whatever she needed them to believe. Her mother had used it for the stage. Arabella had decided to use it for something that would last longer than applause. She spent her first winter in London reading. Not novels, though she read those too, quickly and with great pleasure, but etiquette manuals, society pages, the letters that Gerald left carelessly on the hall table, the conversations she overheard at the modiste and the lending library, and the small afternoon teas to which Gerald's housekeeper occasionally brought her as an afterthought. She listened more than she spoke. She observed more than she participated. By spring, she knew which fork was used for fish, and which family had married beneath themselves 3 generations ago, and why it was still spoken of in certain drawing rooms. She knew which topics made a hostess relax, and which ones made her lean forward. She knew that a woman with good posture and a quiet confidence, and the right shade of blue in her dress, could walk into nearly any room in London and be accepted without a single question asked. She knew because she tested it, carefully, 1 room at a time. By her second season, she was invited everywhere. She told people her parents were dead. It was the simplest version of the truth. Her father was, in fact, dead, had been since she was 4 years old, and as for her mother, well, Arabella had decided at the age of 17 that Vivienne Marceau was dead to her. If the rest of London agreed without knowing the particulars, that was their own generous contribution to the arrangement. She had one rule for herself: One line she did not cross, one habit she permitted herself that she permitted nothing else. Every few months, alone in her room with the door locked, she would take the small wooden box from beneath the loose floorboard and open it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. She would read it, though she had long since memorized every word, and then she would hold it over the candle flame. And every time, at the last moment, she pulled it back. She told herself it was because burning it felt too final. She told herself she simply hadn't decided yet. She told herself many things in that locked room that she did not examine too closely in the daylight. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that the paper was the only thing she had left that was entirely, irreversibly hers. Even the worst things, sometimes, are difficult to let go. It was at the Pemberton Musicale, a stuffy, overwarm evening in March with a soprano who had peaked several years prior, that she first saw the Duke of Ashford. She would not have noticed him, except that everyone else did. There was a shift in the room, subtle but unmistakable, the way a drawing room changes when someone important walks through the door. Spines straightened, fans slowed, conversations dropped half a register. Arabella, who had trained herself to notice such things, looked toward the entrance without appearing to. He was taller than she expected, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed with the particular carelessness of a man who has never needed to try. He did not scan the room the way most men did, looking for familiar faces, for women worth approaching, for the fastest route to the refreshments. He simply stood there for a moment, as though deciding whether the room had earned his presence, and then walked in. No one approached him immediately. That, too, was unusual. Men of his wealth and title were typically descended upon within seconds, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the particular quality of his stillness, that made people hesitate. "The Duke of Ashford," murmured Mrs. Alderton beside her, with the tone of a woman identifying a weather system. "He never comes to these things." "Then why is he here?" Arabella asked. Mrs. Alderton shook her head. "No one ever knows why Ashford does anything. His mother says it's because he was born difficult. His secretary says it's because he sees everything 3 steps ahead and finds most people tedious." She paused. "His enemies say it's because he enjoys watching people make fools of themselves." Arabella looked at him again. He was standing near the window now, holding a glass he hadn't drunk from, watching the soprano with an expression that gave nothing away whatsoever. "What do you think it is?" she asked. "I think," said Mrs. Alderton, "that all 3 are probably true." Arabella filed this information away the way she filed everything, neatly, carefully, in a place she could access when she needed it. Then she turned her attention back to the soprano and thought no more about him. Or so she intended. She had not factored in the lemonade. It was entirely the footman's fault. He turned too sharply, the tray tilted, and the glass that had been perfectly safe on its edge a moment before was suddenly airborne. Arabella stepped back to avoid it and stepped directly into something solid and warm and very much the Duke of Ashford. The glass hit neither of them, it hit the floor. Everyone looked. Arabella looked up. The Duke looked down. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had expected, and his expression was that of a man who had just been surprised, not a common occurrence, she suspected, and not entirely a welcome one. "I beg your pardon," she said. She did not step back. She had learned early that stepping back invited pursuit. He studied her for a moment, not the way most men studied her, with appreciation or assessment, or the particular calculation of someone doing social mathematics. He looked at her the way she sometimes looked at rooms before she entered them, as though he was trying to understand something that wasn't quite visible. "The fault was the footman's," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. "Yes," she agreed, "it was." A beat of silence. Around them, the room had resumed its noise, conversations restarting with the slightly elevated volume of people pretending they hadn't been watching. "You didn't apologize," he said. "You just said the fault was the footman's. Most people apologize anyway." "I find unnecessary apologies confusing," Arabella said. "They make it very difficult to know when someone is actually sorry." He looked at her for another moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the idea of one, glimpsed and gone. "Edmund Cavendish," he said. "I know who you are," she said. And then, because she had nothing to lose by being herself, at least in this particular way, "Arabella Sinclair." "I know who you are," he said. She felt the smallest chill at that, kept her face entirely still. "Then we are well informed," she said pleasantly, and excused herself before he could say anything further. She did not look back. She had learned never to look back. But that night, alone in her room, she took the wooden box from beneath the floorboard and held it for a long time before putting it back without opening it. It was the first time she had done that. She told herself it meant nothing. The second time Arabella saw the Duke of Ashford, she was pretending to admire a painting. It was a very dull painting, a bowl of fruit, rendered in the somber tones of someone who had found still life as a subject, but not yet found any joy in it. And she had been standing in front of it for 6 minutes, which was 4 minutes longer than any painting in Lord Pemberton's gallery deserved. But the alternative was returning to the ballroom, and the ballroom currently contained Sir William Hatch, who had asked her to dance twice already and was, she knew with absolute certainty, preparing to ask a third time. 3 dances with the same man was a declaration. Arabella had no interest in declaring anything to Sir William Hatch. So she stood before the fruit and waited, and it was in that posture, chin slightly raised, expression composed into something that might pass for appreciation, that she heard footsteps behind her and knew, without turning, that they were not Sir William's. Sir William walked with a shuffle. These footsteps were even, unhurried, and entirely without apology. "The grapes are unconvincing," said the Duke of Ashford. Arabella did not startle. She had trained that out of herself years ago. "I thought it was the pear," she said. He came to stand beside her, hands clasped behind his back, studying the painting with the same detached attention he had given the soprano 2 weeks ago. "The pear has a certain sincerity to it. The grapes are simply wrong." "Wrong how?" "They're the wrong shade, and they're too perfect. Real grapes are never that symmetrical." He paused. "Someone painted what they thought grapes should look like rather than what grapes actually look like." Arabella considered this for a moment. Perhaps they found reality unsatisfactory. "Most people do," he said. "It doesn't improve the painting." She glanced at him sidelong. He was looking at the painting still, profile unreadable, and she had the unsettling sense, the same sense she'd had at the musicale, that he was also somehow looking at her. "You're not dancing," she observed. "No. You weren't dancing at the Pemberton musicale either, or at the Harrington dinner from what I'm told, or at Lady Forsyth's card evening, though I understand dancing was not strictly on offer there." He turned to look at her then. "You've been asking about me." "I've been listening," she corrected. "People talk about you rather a lot. You have the distinction of being simultaneously the most sought-after and least available man in London. It makes you very interesting to discuss." "And to you," he said it without particular inflection, which somehow made it more pointed. "Am I interesting to discuss?" She met his gaze steadily. "I find you interesting to observe. That's slightly different." "How so?" "Discussing someone is mostly about the person doing the discussing," Arabella said. "Observing is about the subject." Something moved behind his eyes. Not the shadow of a smile this time, something more careful than that, more considered. "What have you observed?" he asked. She should have deflected. She knew how to deflect, had a dozen responses ready for precisely this kind of conversation, light and pleasant and utterly uninformative. But there was something about the way he asked it, a directness that was so unfashionable as to be almost startling, that made her answer honestly before she had decided to. That you came here tonight for a reason that has nothing to do with Lord Weston's hospitality, she said. That you've spoken to 3 people since you arrived, all briefly, all with purpose. That you don't enjoy these gatherings but you understand their utility. She paused. And that you've been in this gallery for approximately as long as I have, which suggests you're also avoiding someone. A silence. Lord Harwick, he said finally. He's in the card room. We have an ongoing disagreement about a property matter that he has decided to conduct in public whenever possible. Ah, she nodded. He does seem to enjoy a public setting. You know him. I know of him. Which was true and also careful, and concealed the fact that the mention of Lord Harwick's name had sent a thin, cold thread of something through her chest that she had no intention of examining in present company. He has a reputation for persistence. He has a reputation for worse than that, Edmund said flatly. Then, as though catching himself, forgive me, that was. Honest, Arabella said. I told you I find unnecessary apologies confusing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He smiled briefly, genuinely, without calculation. It changed his face entirely. Arabella looked back at the painting and made a private, firm, and completely useless resolution to be more careful. She was not more careful. It was difficult to be careful around a man who paid attention the way Edmund Cavendish paid attention. Most men listen to a woman with the expression of someone waiting politely for their turn to speak. Edmund listened as though what she said was information he actually intended to use, as though she were worth the effort of genuine comprehension. It was, she found, deeply inconvenient. Over the following 3 weeks they encountered each other 7 times, which was not remarkable in itself. London society in full season was a small world and the same faces appeared everywhere. But what was remarkable was that each encounter felt, somehow, deliberate on both sides. She did not seek him out. She was almost certain of that. But she also did not avoid him, and she began to notice that he did not avoid her, and that there was a difference between 2 people not avoiding each other and 2 people accidentally occupying the same rooms. He remembered things she said, not in the ostentatious way of a man performing attentiveness, but quietly, in passing, a reference, weeks later to something she'd mentioned in an earlier conversation, slipped into a new one so naturally she almost missed it. She found this more alarming than flattery would have been. Flattery she knew how to dismiss. She began, without fully acknowledging it, to do the same. To file away the things he said not in the careful professional manner she filed information about everyone else, but differently, in a warmer place, a less guarded one. This was a problem. She understood the shape of the problem very clearly. She had, after all, built her entire life on understanding the shape of things before they became dangerous. Edmund Cavendish was the Duke of Ashford, one of the most powerful men in England, with a lineage that could be traced to the Conquest, and a fortune that made lesser titles look decorative. She was Arabella Sinclair, who had arrived in London on a hired coach with a wooden box under her arm and a story she had written herself. If he looked closely enough, and she was increasingly certain he was capable of looking very closely indeed, he would find the seams. She told herself to be sensible. She told herself that what she felt in his company, the particular ease of it, the way her mind ran faster and more freely than it did with anyone else, the alarming frequency with which she said what she actually thought rather than what was appropriate, was simply novelty. She had never met a man quite like him. That was all. She almost believed it. It was at the Alderton Ball, on a Thursday evening in April, that things became complicated in a way she could no longer dismiss. She had been dancing with Sir Thomas Everett, who was pleasant and dull, and caused her no concern whatsoever, when she became aware that Edmund was watching her from across the room. Not obviously. He was in conversation with a man she didn't recognize, apparently attending to what was being said. But his gaze found her twice during the dance, and the second time she caught it and held it for a moment before Sir Thomas required her attention again. When the dance ended and Sir Thomas returned her to the edge of the room, Edmund was there. He had moved with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did, and he was standing close enough to speak to her without being overheard, which was either deliberate or coincidental, and she strongly suspected it was not coincidental. "You dance well," he said. "You don't dance at all," she said. "I've confirmed this with multiple witnesses now. I dance when I have reason to." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, less guarded than usual, or perhaps differently guarded, as though he had made some internal decision and was still deciding whether to tell her about it. "Miss Sinclair," he said. "Your Grace, I find I am running out of accidental reasons to speak with you." A pause. "I thought you should know that before I begin manufacturing deliberate ones." The ballroom continued around them. Music, laughter, the rustle of silk and the clink of glasses. And Arabella stood very still in the middle of it and looked at the Duke of Ashford and felt, with absolute clarity, two simultaneous and completely contradictory things. The first was something warm and certain, and frightening in its intensity. The second was the cold, specific knowledge of everything she had not told him, everything he did not know, everything that stood between the woman he was looking at and the woman she actually was. "That is either very honest or very dangerous," she said. "With you," he said, "I suspect they're the same thing." She should have walked away. She had walked away from safer things than this. She had left rooms, cities, versions of herself, had done it without looking back and never regretted it. She did not walk away. "Then you had better be very careful," she said quietly, "what you manufacture." He held her gaze for a moment. "Likewise," he said. And that, Arabella would think later, much later, on a morning full of silk and roses, and a letter she did not yet know existed, was the moment she stopped being careful. Not all at once, not visibly, but somewhere beneath the composure and the practiced ease and the years of knowing exactly who she was pretending to be, something had shifted. The girl with no past had started to want a future. And futures, she knew better than anyone, had a way of demanding the truth. She saw her mother on a Wednesday. It was not planned. Nothing involving Vivienne Marceau was ever planned. That had been true when Arabella was a child watching her mother reinvent herself between engagements, and it was apparently still true now, 7 years and an entire invented life later. Vivienne did not operate on schedules. She operated on instinct and opportunity, and she had, it seemed, identified both. Arabella was leaving the modiste on Regent Street, a paper-wrapped package under her arm, and her mind occupied with the question of whether the green silk was a practical choice or simply a beautiful one, when she looked up and stopped walking. Her mother was standing 20 feet away. Vivienne Marceau had always been striking in the way that certain women are striking, not conventionally beautiful, but constructed, deliberately and with great skill, to appear so. She knew which colors made her skin luminous. She knew how to hold herself so that a room's light fell on her at the best possible angle. She had taught Arabella everything she knew about performance, about presence, about the architecture of a woman that other people would believe in. She had not taught her to be kind. That Arabella had learned elsewhere or learned to do without. Vivienne looked well. That was the first thing Arabella noticed, and it produced a complicated feeling she did not have time to untangle. She was dressed expensively, not lavishly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had recently acquired access to real money. Her dark hair, threaded now with silver she had never had when Arabella last saw her, was arranged with care. She looked like a woman who had landed somewhere comfortable. She was looking directly at Arabella. There was a moment, very brief, a fraction of a second in which Arabella considered turning, walking the other way, pretending she had not seen, not recognized, not felt the particular cold flood of feeling that her mother's face reliably produced in her. Then Vivienne smiled and tilted her head and the moment passed. Arabella crossed the street. They sat in a tea room 3 blocks away, at a corner table that Arabella chose for its privacy, and did not speak until the tea had come and the girl who brought it had gone. Around them, other women talked about other things, and the ordinariness of it felt almost offensive, that the world should continue so cheerfully, while Arabella sat across from the woman she had buried in her own mind 7 years ago, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "You look well," Vivienne said. "As do you." Arabella kept her voice level. "You're in London." "I've been in London for some months." "I didn't know that." "No," Vivienne agreed pleasantly. "You weren't meant to." A pause, the particular kind her mother used when she wanted something, a gathering pause, a preparatory one. "I've been watching you, though, from a distance. You've done beautifully, Arabella, truly. I couldn't have managed it better myself." The compliment landed the way her mother's compliments always landed, like something with a hook inside it. "What do you want, Vivienne?" she asked. Her mother's expression shifted, not hurt exactly, but performing the idea of it. "Is that how we are now, after all this time?" "You chose how we are," Arabella said quietly. "I simply accepted it." A silence, the tea cooled between them. "I'm in some difficulty," Vivienne said finally. The performance dropped slightly, and beneath it Arabella caught a glimpse of something real, not vulnerability. Her mother did not do vulnerability, but a kind of compressed urgency that she recognized as genuine. "I am staying with someone who has been generous, but the arrangement is not permanent, and I find myself in need of money," Arabella said. Vivienne did not flinch. "A small amount, enough to—" "With whom are you staying?" Arabella asked. Not because it would change her answer, because the expensive dress and the London address and the months of proximity without contact were adding to a picture she needed to see clearly. Her mother's eyes moved, just briefly, just a fraction before steadying. "A friend, an old acquaintance who has been kind enough to offer." "A name, Vivienne." Another pause, the kind that answered the question before the words did. "Lord Harwick," her mother said. "He's an old—" "I know who he is," Arabella said. The tea room continued around them. Somewhere a cup was set down too hard and rattled in its saucer. Arabella sat very still and looked at her mother, and felt the cold thread she had felt at the mere mention of Harwick's name 3 weeks ago pull tighter and tighter, until it was something close to a wire. Lord Harwick, Edmund's enemy. The man who conducted public disagreements and had, according to Edmund's unguarded moment in the gallery, a reputation for worse than persistence. "How long?" she asked. "I told you, some months." "Has he asked about me?" Vivienne's eyes did not move this time. She was too careful for that. But something happened in her expression, a microsecond of recalibration, that told Arabella everything she needed to know before her mother said, smoothly, "Why would he ask about you, darling? He doesn't know you exist." Arabella looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she took her purse from her bag, removed several folded notes, and placed them on the table between them. Not the full amount she could have given. Enough to be useful without being enough to be permanent. "This is all I can offer," she said. "And Vivienne, it is the last time." Her mother looked at the money. Then she looked at Arabella with an expression that managed to contain, simultaneously, gratitude and resentment, and something that might, in a different woman, have been called grief. "You're very like your father," Vivienne said softly. "I wouldn't know," Arabella said. "You never told me enough about him to compare." She stood, collected her package, and left the money on the table. She did not look back. She never looked back. But she walked 3 blocks before her hand stopped trembling, and that night she went to bed without eating and lay awake until the early hours of the morning, listening to the city and thinking about chess. About the way a board looked when you suddenly understood, too late, that the pieces had been moved without your noticing, and that what had seemed like an open game was already decided. She thought about Edmund, about the warmth of him, the directness of him, the way he had said, "I find I am running out of accidental reasons to speak with you," and meant every word. She thought about Lord Harwick in his house somewhere in this city, with her mother at his table. She thought about the wooden box beneath the floorboard and the paper inside it, and the name written at the top of it that was not Sinclair. "He doesn't know you exist." Her mother had held her gaze when she said it. Vivienne Marceau had been performing for 30 years, and she was very, very good at it. But Arabella had learned from her, which meant Arabella also knew, with quiet and absolute certainty, exactly what it looked like when her mother was lying. She saw Edmund 4 days later, at a small dinner that Lady Forsyth hosted with the transparent aim of placing him next to her eldest daughter. Lady Forsyth's eldest daughter was pleasant and pretty and visibly terrified of him, which Edmund handled with a careful courtesy that Arabella suspected cost him some effort. He found her afterward in the drawing room, where she had positioned herself near the window with a small glass of wine and a clear view of the door, a habit so old she no longer noticed it. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "I'm often quiet. Not like this." He said it without accusation, simply as an observation, the way he said most things. "You're usually quiet in the way of someone who is listening. Tonight you're quiet in the way of someone who is somewhere else entirely." She looked at him. In the candlelight his face was all shadows and angles, and he was watching her with that particular attention of his, the kind that made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed, and that she had stopped being able to dismiss as mere novelty. "I had an unexpected encounter this week," she said carefully. "An old acquaintance, someone from before London, before a great many things." He didn't press. That was one of the things about him that undid her most consistently. He knew when not to push, and he exercised that knowledge with a restraint that most people would not have managed. He simply stood beside her and let the silence be what it was. "Edmund," she said, and then stopped. She had not meant to use his name. It came out of some less guarded part of her that was apparently conducting its own separate relationship with him without consulting the rest of her. He didn't comment on it. "Yes." She looked at her wine, at the window, at the dark street beyond it where London moved about its ordinary business. "If you discovered that someone you trusted had not told you the entire truth about themselves," she said, slowly and with great care, "what would you do?" A pause. She felt him considering the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than reaching for an easy answer. "That would depend," he said, "on why they hadn't told me. What are the acceptable reasons?" "Fear," he said, "shame they hadn't yet learned to put down, a past that felt too large and too complicated to hand to someone else." Another pause. "Those are human reasons. I understand human reasons." "And the unacceptable ones?" "Wanting something from me that the truth would have prevented them from getting," he said, "using the omission as a tool, deciding for me what I was capable of knowing." He looked at her. "That's different." She nodded slowly, turned the wine glass in her hands. "Arabella," her name in his voice had a quality she could not fully describe. "Whatever it is you're not telling me." "Don't," she said softly, not a rebuke, something closer to a plea. He stopped. "Not yet," she said. "Please, just not yet." The longest pause of the evening. Outside, a carriage passed. Somewhere in the drawing room, Lady Forsyth laughed at something. "All right," Edmund said quietly. "Not yet." And he stayed beside her for the rest of the evening and asked her nothing further. And Arabella stood next to him in the candlelight and told herself she would tell him soon, that she would find the words, that she would sit down with the wooden box and open it and hand it to him and let him decide. She told herself many things that night. What she did not know, could not know, standing there in the warmth of that drawing room, was that 4 streets away, in a tall house with green shutters on Cavendish Square, Lord Harwick was pouring her mother a glass of wine and asking, with the particular casualness of a man who had been patient for a very long time, whether Vivienne had managed to see her daughter recently. And that her mother, after only the briefest of pauses, had said yes. And that Lord Harwick had smiled, and said that was very good news indeed, and refilled her glass. The proposal happened on a Tuesday, which was, Arabella would think afterward, a very undramatic day for something that rearranged the entire architecture of her life. It had been 6 weeks since the tea room, 6 weeks since her mother's carefully held gaze and the lie that sat behind it like a stone beneath shallow water. Arabella had spent those 6 weeks being sensible. She had been thorough and consistent and entirely disciplined about it, attending the right events, smiling at the right people, keeping her conversations with Edmund to the pleasant, careful length that social occasions naturally imposed. It had not worked in the slightest. The difficulty was that Edmund was not cooperating with her sensibility. He was not dramatic about it. He did not send flowers or write letters or make the kind of visible, declarative gestures that would have given her something concrete to deflect. He simply continued to be exactly what he had always been, which was attentive and direct and possessed of an intelligence that matched hers in a way she had not encountered before, and was increasingly unable to pretend was merely pleasant. He remembered, at a Tuesday evening concert, that she had mentioned 3 weeks prior preferring the left side of a room for the acoustics, and found her a seat accordingly without remarking on it. He disagreed with her, at a dinner party in Mayfair, about the relative merits of a particular parliamentary decision, and did so with such genuine engagement, not performing debate, but actually thinking alongside her, that she had argued back for 20 minutes and enjoyed every second of it, and hated herself for that enjoyment approximately half as much as she should have. He looked at her, consistently and without apology, as though she was the most interesting thing in whatever room they occupied. She was, she understood, in serious trouble. The Tuesday in question was overcast, threatening rain that had not yet committed to falling, and Arabella was walking in the park with her friend Charlotte Alderton, who was talking about a new bonnet with the focused passion that Charlotte brought to all her enthusiasms. Arabella was listening with half her attention, and using the other half to argue herself out of a decision she had not yet admitted to making when she heard her name. Edmund was riding along the path, alone, without the groom that social convention suggested he ought to have, and he pulled up with the ease of someone who had perhaps not accidentally chosen this particular route at this particular hour. Charlotte made a sound beside her that was not quite a word, but communicated considerable information nonetheless. Edmund dismounted with fluid efficiency, handed his reins to a nearby park attendant with a coin and an authority that invited no question, and came to join them on the path. He greeted Charlotte with the correct measure of courtesy, made 2 minutes of entirely adequate conversation, and then Charlotte, who was many things but never obtuse, suddenly recalled an urgent matter near the fountain and excused herself with the transparent cheerfulness of someone doing a favor she expected to hear about in detail later. They were left alone in the approximate way that 2 people are alone in a public park, observed from a distance, technically unchaperoned, in a manner that in Arabella's world carried implications. She looked at him, he looked at her. "You've been avoiding me," he said. Not an accusation. A statement precise and unadorned in the manner of a man who had decided they were past the stage of polite fictions. "I've been present at several of the same events as you," she said. "Present and distant are not the same thing. You know that as well as I do." He fell into step beside her along the gravel path. The trees on either side were beginning to bud, tentatively, as though the weather had not yet earned their full commitment. "I would like to understand why." "Edmund, I would also like," he continued, with the particular quality of a man who has prepared what he intends to say, and is going to say it regardless, "to stop pretending that what I want is simply to continue attending the same events as you and talking about architecture and parliamentary reform, and occasionally standing beside you without sufficient reason." Arabella looked straight ahead. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. Somewhere a bird was making a decision about the coming rain. "I am not a man who does things without purpose," Edmund said. "I think you know that. I think you've known it for some time." A pause. "I think I have been clear enough that what I am about to say should not be a surprise, and if it is, then I have been considerably less clear than I believed." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "Arabella." He turned to face her, and she made herself look at him, which was its own particular difficulty because his expression was open in a way she had rarely seen it. Not unguarded exactly. Edmund was never fully unguarded, but sincere in a way that cost him something. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because the season demands it, not because my family has decided it's time, not for any reason that has anything to do with anything other than the fact that you are. You are entirely unlike anyone I have ever met, and I find I am no longer able to reasonably argue myself out of wanting to spend the remainder of my life talking to you." The park continued around them. A child ran past with a hoop somewhere to their left. The clouds shifted overhead and the light changed briefly to something golden and impractical. Arabella looked at the man in front of her and felt, with extraordinary clarity, both things she had felt the night he told her he was running out of accidental reasons, the warmth and the cold, the want and the knowledge of everything that stood against it. Only they were larger now, both of them, the warmth almost unbearably so. "No," she said. Something moved through his expression, controlled immediately, but she saw it. "No," he repeated. "I can't." She held his gaze because she owed him that much. "Edmund, there are things you don't know about me, things that would change." "Then tell me," he said, quiet, direct. "Tell me the things I don't know." "It's not that simple." "It rarely is. Tell me anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. At the steadiness of him, the patience of him, the way he was standing in front of her with his proposal just refused, and his pride intact and his attention unbroken, simply waiting for her to find a way through. She thought about Vivienne, about Lord Harwick, about the wooden box and the paper inside it and the name that was not Sinclair and all the careful architecture of the past 7 years. She thought about what it would cost him to know. Not him alone, his name, his position, the cold mathematics of what a duke's wife was required to be. She thought about the drawing rooms of London and the way gossip moved through them like weather, and about Edmund's enemies, of which she was increasingly aware he had several, and about the particular cruelty of handing a man like that a weapon made of the woman he loved. "I can't tell you," she said. Not yet, and I understand if that means." "Marry me anyway," he said. She blinked. "What?" "I said marry me anyway." He said it with the same directness he said everything, but beneath it was something she had not heard from him before, something exposed, something that had decided the risk was worth it. "I am not asking you to have no past. I am not asking for a woman without complications. I am asking for you specifically, with whatever you are not yet ready to tell me. I am asking because I believe I know that whatever it is, it does not change what I see when I look at you." "You don't know what it is," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "No," he agreed. "I don't. I'm asking you to trust me with it when you're ready." The clouds above them made their decision. The first drops of rain began to fall, soft and tentative, darkening the gravel at their feet. Arabella stood in the beginning of the rain and looked at Edmund Cavendish and felt something give way inside her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the manner of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time and had finally, in the face of something it had not been built to withstand, simply let go. "You are," she said quietly, "the most unreasonably stubborn man I have ever met." "Yes," he agreed. "Will you marry me?" A long pause. The rain increased slightly. Neither of them moved. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, just barely, just enough for her to see it, and she understood in that small release exactly how much the answer had mattered to him, and the understanding of it made the warmth almost painful in its intensity. He did not take her hand. They were in a public park in the rain, and he was Edmund Cavendish, and he did not do things without considering their consequences. But he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before and hoped, with a fierceness that frightened her, she would spend the rest of her life seeing. Charlotte appeared from the direction of the fountain with impeccable timing and an expression of elaborate innocence that convinced absolutely no one. She told herself, walking home that afternoon with Charlotte chattering beside her and the rain settling into something more committed, that she would tell him. Soon, before the wedding, she would find the right moment and the right words, and she would sit down with him somewhere private and quiet, and she would tell him everything, the name, the box, the mother in the green-shuttered house, and she would let him decide with the full information in front of him. She told herself this with great conviction. She almost believed it. That evening, she took the wooden box from beneath the floorboard and sat with it on her bed for a long time. She did not open it. She simply held it in both hands and thought about Edmund's face when she had said yes, and the way his breath had released, and what it meant that a man like that, careful, composed, controlled, could be made to exhale like that by a single word from her. She put the box on her nightstand. Not under the floor, on the nightstand. It was a small thing. It meant nothing, she told herself. It meant everything. 4 streets away, in the tall house with green shutters on Cavendish Square, Lord Harwick received a note from his man of business and read it twice, slowly, with the focused attention of someone identifying a useful piece of information. The Duke of Ashford and Miss Arabella Sinclair had been seen in the park that afternoon, alone, for approximately 8 minutes in the rain. Harwick set the note down and looked at the fire for a moment. Then he called for Vivienne. She came in with the slightly elevated wariness she always carried in his house now. She had learned, over the past months, to read his moods with some accuracy, which was intelligent of her, though it had come slightly too late to be fully useful. "Your daughter," Harwick said pleasantly, "has apparently accepted a proposal from the Duke of Ashford." Vivienne went very still. "I wonder," Harwick continued in the same pleasant tone, pouring himself a drink with the unhurried manner of a man who has just watched a chess board clarify considerably, "whether you might tell me more about her, the parts you've been keeping back specifically." He looked at Vivienne over his glass. "I think it's time, don't you?" Vivienne sat down. She did not speak immediately. She sat in the chair across from him and looked at the fire and was, for once, entirely without performance. Just a woman doing a calculation in her head, a specific and terrible calculation, and arriving at an answer she had perhaps always known she would arrive at and had been hoping foolishly to avoid. "What would you like to know?" she said finally. Harwick smiled. "Everything," he said. "Start with her real name." And Vivienne Marceau, who had taught her daughter everything she knew about survival and nothing about loyalty, began to talk. The engagement was announced on a Friday. By Saturday morning, it was in every drawing room in London, carried by the particular velocity that only truly significant social news achieved. Not the breathless, slightly scandalized speed of gossip, but the weightier, more considered momentum of information that people understood would matter. The Duke of Ashford was to be married. The Duke of Ashford, who had declined every eligible woman in England for 15 years, who had inherited at 22 and resisted every maternal campaign and social maneuver, and carefully arranged coincidence since, had apparently been undone by a Viscount's niece from Shropshire whom nobody had heard of 3 years ago. London had opinions. London always had opinions. Most of them were delivered to Arabella directly, with the particular warmth of people who wish to establish, retroactively, that they had always liked her enormously. She accepted the congratulations with grace and the scrutiny with composure, and went home each evening and sat quietly in her room and waited for the feeling of impending disaster to pass. It did not pass. It simply became familiar, the way a persistent ache becomes familiar, present always, sharp only when she pressed on it. She pressed on it often. She could not seem to stop. Edmund's mother received her on a Wednesday. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford was a small, upright woman of 60 with silver hair and an expression of permanent assessment that reminded Arabella, disconcertingly, of her son. She received Arabella in a sitting room full of excellent furniture and better portraits, offered tea with the deliberate courtesy of a woman withholding judgment until she had sufficient information, and proceeded to conduct the most thorough and elegantly disguised interrogation Arabella had ever experienced. Her parents, her childhood, her education, her opinions on a range of subjects that widened gradually from the innocuous to the genuinely probing, in the manner of someone testing not the answers but the quality of the mind producing them. Arabella answered everything that could be answered honestly. Everything else she answered with the careful partial truth she had spent years perfecting, and she did it well, and she was aware throughout that the Dowager Duchess was watching her with eyes very like Edmund's, dark, attentive, missing very little. At the end of an hour, the Dowager Duchess set down her cup. "You are not what I expected," she said. "I'm not sure what you expected," Arabella said. "Something easier to read." A pause, not unkind. "Edmund has never chosen anything for simple reasons. I stopped expecting simple reasons from him a long time ago." She looked at Arabella with an expression that was, at last, something warmer than assessment. "He looks at you differently." "Differently than what?" "Differently than he looks at everything else," the Dowager said. "Which is, in my experience of my son, the most significant thing he is capable of communicating." She picked up her cup again. "I hope you understand what that means." "I'm beginning to," Arabella said quietly. The Dowager Duchess nodded once, with finality, and the interrogation became a conversation. And by the time Arabella left an hour later, she had been approved of in the particular way that mattered most, not effusively, not easily, but genuinely, by a woman who did not give her approval easily and knew exactly what she was giving it for. She sat in the carriage on the way home and thought about what it would do to that woman, to Edmund's mother, with her silver hair and her careful eyes, when the truth came out. Because it would come out. Arabella had known this since the tea room, perhaps before. She had simply been refusing to look at it directly. She looked at it now. Vivienne came to Wentworth Street on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the engagement was announced, and Arabella knew when she saw her mother's face at the door that this was not about money. She brought her in anyway, closed the door of the small sitting room, did not offer tea. Vivienne sat down without being invited and looked at her hands for a moment, which was so unlike her that Arabella felt the first genuine alarm of the evening before a word had been spoken. "I've done something," Vivienne said. Arabella sat very still. "Tell me." He asked questions. Vivienne looked up, Her eyes were bright in the way they got when she was frightened, though she would never have called it that. He's been asking questions for months, small ones at first, the kind you could answer without feeling you'd given anything away. And then she stopped, started again. He's very clever, Arabella, cleverer than I remembered. He doesn't ask for things directly. He asks for adjacent things, and you answer those, and then one day you realize you've handed him the whole picture without ever meaning to. What did you tell him? Not everything at once. It happened gradually. I told myself each piece was small enough to. Vivienne, Arabella's voice was quiet and absolutely flat. What does Harwick know? Her mother looked at her with an expression that contained, beneath the performance and the justification and the years of carefully maintained self-regard, something raw and genuinely sorry, not sorry enough, never quite sorry enough, but present nonetheless. Your name, Vivienne said, your father's name, the circumstances of your birth, a pause, the papers. The room was very quiet. The papers, Arabella repeated. He found someone, an old clerk from the parish in Hertfordshire. I didn't know he had them until. He has the birth record, Arabella said, not a question. Vivienne nodded. Arabella stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street because she needed something to look at that was not her mother's face. And she stood there for a long moment while the full shape of what had happened assembled itself in her mind with the terrible clarity of something she had always known was coming, and had never fully allowed herself to see. Lord Harwick had the birth record, the record that listed not Arabella Sinclair, niece of Gerald Fitch of Shropshire, but her real name, her father's name. The particular, ruinous truth of her origins that she had spent 7 years burying under a carefully constructed fiction. When, she asked. I don't know exactly when he. When did you understand what he was doing? A long pause. Some time ago, Vivienne said quietly. Arabella turned from the window. She looked at her mother, at the expensive dress and the careful hair, and the eyes that were bright with something that might have been remorse if it had arrived earlier and meant more, and felt something settle in her chest. Not anger, exactly. Something older and quieter than anger. Something she had been carrying since she was 17 years old, and had simply learned to carry so consistently she had almost forgotten its weight. You should go, she said. Arabella. Please, the word came out with unexpected force. She modulated it. Please go, Vivienne. Her mother stood. She gathered herself in the way she always gathered herself, spine straightening, chin lifting, the performance resuming its position over whatever was actually happening beneath it. At the door, she stopped. I told myself it would come to nothing, she said. That he was gathering information but wouldn't use it. That if you were marrying the Duke, it would be too dangerous even for Harwick too. Did you believe that? Arabella asked. A pause, the longest one yet. No, Vivienne said and left. Arabella sat alone in the sitting room for a long time after the door closed. She sat without moving and without thinking in any directed way, simply letting the full weight of the situation rest on her without trying yet to manage it. She had learned, in difficult moments, that there was a stage of simply receiving bad news that had to be completed before the practical mind could engage usefully, and that trying to skip it generally made everything worse. When it was done, when she had sat with it long enough that it had stopped feeling like a blow and started feeling like information, she got up and went to her room and took the wooden box from the nightstand where it had sat since the night of the proposal. She opened it. The paper inside was worn at the folds, softened by years of handling. She had read it so many times she saw the words before she looked at them. Parish of St. Michael, Hertfordshire, born the 14th of March, 1793, father, Richard Ashby, natural son of the Earl of Compton, mother, Vivienne Marceau, actress, child, female, name given. The name written in the last line was not Arabella. It was not Sinclair. She folded it again, put it back. She had always known this moment would come. Had known, really, since Edmund had said, "I find I am running out of accidental reasons to speak with you," and she had not walked away. Known it since the park in the rain and the yes she had said, and the way his breath had released at the word. She had known and she had chosen anyway, and she did not even now fully regret it. What she regretted was the timing. What she regretted was that the choice of when to tell him had been taken from her by her mother's weakness and Harwick's patience, and that Edmund would now learn the truth not from her, not in the quiet, private way she had always intended, but from his enemy, at a moment of his enemy's choosing, designed for maximum damage. She picked up the box, held it. Then she set it down and went to her writing desk and took out a sheet of paper, and sat for a very long time with the pen in her hand and the blank page in front of her. She wrote Edmund's name at the top. Then she stopped. She sat there until the candle burned low, the pen in her hand, the page mostly empty, trying to find the beginning of the thing she should have said months ago. She did not find it that night. She told herself she would find it tomorrow, that she would write it tomorrow or tell him in person or something. Something before Harwick moved, something that would give Edmund the truth in her voice rather than his enemies. She blew out the candle and went to bed and did not sleep. Lord Harwick moved on a Monday. He did not move dramatically. That was not his way. He was a man who understood that the most effective damage was the kind that looked, from the outside, like an accident, information shared not maliciously but regretfully, in the manner of a concerned friend performing an unwelcome duty. He called on Lord Pemberton, who was old, well-connected, and could be relied upon to feel that his friendship with Edmund's family obligated him to share important information with appropriate parties. And over a long lunch mentioned, with great apparent reluctance, that he had come across some troubling documents pertaining to the background of the Duke of Ashford's intended. He did not give Pemberton the documents. He described their contents carefully with just enough detail to be credible, and just enough omission to ensure that what Pemberton carried away was the shape of a scandal rather than the specifics of one. Specifics could be checked. Shapes simply spread. By Tuesday evening, 3 households had heard something. By Wednesday, 7. By Thursday, the whispers had reached the edges of Edmund's social world. Not his inner circle, not yet, but the outer rings, the acquaintances and the distant connections, and the people who attended the same clubs and the same dinners without being trusted. Edmund heard something on Thursday afternoon. Arabella did not know this until later. What she knew was that on Thursday evening, Edmund came to Wentworth Street unannounced, which he had never done, and Gerald Fitch, who was nearsighted and conflict-averse, and had been trying to read in his study, showed him to the sitting room with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had opened his door to a duke and was still processing it. Arabella came downstairs and found Edmund standing in the middle of the room with his hands behind his back, and his face arranged with the careful control of someone managing something large and not entirely manageable. She knew, looking at him, that he had heard something. She did not know yet how much. She also knew, looking at him, that she had run out of time. "Sit down," she said, "please. There is something I should have told you a long time ago." He looked at her for a moment, then he sat. And Arabella Sinclair, who was not, had never been, Arabella Sinclair, sat down across from the man she loved and opened her mouth, and finally, at last, far too late and not nearly late enough, began to tell the truth. She talked for a long time. She had imagined this conversation in many forms over the past months, had rehearsed versions of it in the dark, lying awake with the wooden box on the nightstand, constructing and discarding openings, testing words for their weight and their accuracy and their capacity to land without destroying. In none of those imagined versions had she found the right beginning. She had simply never found it. So she did not look for a beginning now. She started in the middle, the way one actually starts things, and let the rest arrange itself around it. She told him her real name. She watched his face as she said it, and he gave her nothing, not shock, not withdrawal, just that particular quality of attention she had come to know as his most serious mode of listening. She told him about her father, Richard Ashby, natural son of the Earl of Compton, not illegitimate in the technical sense. His parents had been briefly and disastrously married, but the marriage had been annulled before his birth was registered, and the Earl had spent the remainder of his life pretending the entire episode had not occurred. Richard Ashby had therefore grown up with a name but no position, an ancestry but no acknowledgement, and the particular bitterness of a man who could see exactly what he was owed, and had no legal mechanism to collect it. He had died when Arabella was 4. She remembered almost nothing about him except his hands and the smell of tobacco, and the way her mother had looked at him. Not with love, exactly, but with the specific intensity of two people who understood each other's damage. She told him about her mother, about the theater, the performances, the series of arrangements that had kept them housed and fed in the years after her father died, arrangements that Arabella had understood too young and her mother had never apologized for. About the moment at 17 when she had understood, finally and completely, that Vivienne would always choose Vivienne, and that waiting for anything else was simply a way of choosing to be hurt on a schedule. She told him about leaving, about Gerald Fitch and the hired coach in the box, about the paper inside the box and why she had never quite burned it. She told him about Vivienne in London, about Harwick's house and the green shutters and the conversation in the tea room and the money on the table and her mother's eyes when she lied. She told him everything. Edmund sat across from her and did not speak and did not look away, and when she was done the room was very quiet, and the candle on the side table had burned considerably lower than it had been when she started. She waited. "Your father's name," Edmund said finally. His voice was even. "Ashby." "Yes." "Natural son of Compton." "Yes." A pause. "Compton died 4 years ago. The title passed to a cousin." He was thinking, she could see it, not about her, not yet, but about the legal and social geometry of what she had told him. "There's no living connection to claim." "No," she said. "There never was. That was rather the point of the Earl's arrangement." Edmund looked at the fire, then back at her. "The name you were born with, the one on the record." "Harwick has the record," she said, "or a copy of it." "I know," a beat. "I heard something today at the club, nothing specific, the shape of something, the suggestion of a rumor not yet fully formed." His jaw tightened slightly. "I came here directly." "I know," she said. "I saw it on your face when you came in." "You were going to tell me before I heard it elsewhere." It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway, honestly, because she was done with anything that was not honest. "I was trying to find the words. I have been trying to find them for some time." She met his gaze. "That is not an excuse. I should have found them sooner." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. His expression was still carefully controlled, but she knew him well enough now to read beneath the control, could see the particular quality of stillness that meant he was managing something, working through something, not performing composure but actually requiring it. "Why didn't you?" he asked. "When I proposed, when I told you there were things I could know, why not then?" "Because I was afraid," she said, simply, without decoration. "Not of what you would do, of what it would cost you. Your name, your position, what a duke's wife is required to be and what I am not. I told myself I was protecting you." She paused. "I think I was also protecting myself, from having given you everything and then watching you decide it wasn't enough." The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Edmund stood up. He walked to the window, the same window she had stood at after her mother left, looking out at the street to avoid looking at something harder. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she watched him and waited and did not look away. Then he turned around. "I need a few days," he said. Something dropped in her chest. She kept her face still. "Of course." "Not," he stopped, ran a hand along his jaw in a gesture she recognized as rare, a crack in the composure. "Not because I am reconsidering. I want to be clear about that. I am not reconsidering." He looked at her steadily. "But I need to understand the full scope of what Harwick has and what he intends to do with it, and I need to do that clearly without—" He stopped again. "Without what?" she asked quietly. "Without being in the same room as you," he said. "Because apparently I am significantly less clear-headed in your presence than I am in general, which I find both inconvenient and entirely your fault." Something released in her chest, not everything, but enough. "That seems fair," she said. He crossed back to her. He stood in front of her and looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the park in the rain, open, deliberate, the risk already decided upon. "I am angry," he said. "I want you to know that. Not at the circumstances, at you specifically, for not telling me sooner, for deciding alone what I could and couldn't manage." "I know," she said. "You're right to be." "I am also—" He paused. Something moved through his expression that was not anger. "I'm also entirely certain that none of it changes anything that matters, and I find those two things somewhat difficult to hold simultaneously, which is why I need the few days." She nodded. He was close enough that she could have touched him, and she did not, because it was not the moment for it and they both knew it. "Edmund," she said. "Yes. I'm sorry. Not the performative kind. The real kind, the kind that had weight and meant she wished she had done differently and would do differently now if she could. I'm genuinely sorry." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said, and left. He came back on Saturday. He came to Wentworth Street in the morning, before calling hours, which was irregular enough that Gerald Fitch answered the door himself in his dressing gown, and stood in the hallway looking between them with the expression of a man who had agreed to a simple arrangement, and found himself in the middle of something considerably more complex than advertised. Edmund took no notice of Gerald. He looked at Arabella and said, without preamble, "I've spoken to my solicitor, and to a man I trust who has some experience with Harwick's methods." "Come in," she said. They sat in the sitting room. The wooden box was on the table between them. She had put it there that morning, some instinct telling her it belonged in the open now, that the era of hiding it was finished. Edmund looked at it but didn't touch it. Harwick is building something. The rumor at the club was the beginning, a test, to see how quickly it spreads and where it reaches. He won't move directly until he believes the ground is prepared. He looked at her. "We have perhaps 2 weeks before he does something definitive." "What does definitive look like?" "Letters, copies of the record sent to specific people. Possibly a public statement, though that carries risk for him too. He's not untouchable." Edmund's voice was measured, analytical, the voice of a man who had been thinking about this for 2 days with the considerable resources of his intelligence and had arrived somewhere useful. "He wants the wedding stopped. Or, failing that, he wants it tainted. A scandal that follows us into the marriage and gives him leverage indefinitely." "Why?" she asked. "The property dispute, is it worth this?" "The property dispute is not the point," Edmund said. "The point is me. We have a history that goes beyond the land. I blocked something he wanted very badly 3 years ago. Something that would have given him considerably more influence than he currently has." He paused. "He's been patient. I'll give him that." Arabella looked at the box. "If the record becomes public—" "It will be talked about," Edmund said directly. "I won't pretend otherwise. There are people who will use it, and there are drawing rooms it will reach, and there will be a period of difficulty." He met her gaze. "I want you to understand that clearly. I am not offering you a life without consequence." "I know," she said. "I am offering you a life in which the consequences are faced together," he said, "which is a different thing." She looked at him across the small table with the worn wooden box between them and thought about 7 years of facing everything alone. Every room she had walked into and assessed and managed and navigated without anyone beside her who knew the whole of it. The particular exhaustion of that. The particular loneliness that she had been so practiced at not feeling that she had almost stopped knowing it was there. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to get married," Edmund said. "Sooner than planned, this week if we can manage it quietly with the people we trust before Harwick finishes preparing his ground." He paused. "And then I want to deal with Harwick, comprehensively." She looked at him. "You have something." It was not a question. She knew his face well enough to read the particular quality of his stillness when he was sitting on information. The shadow of a smile. Harwick has not been careful over the years about the methods he uses to acquire what he wants. I have been careful over the years to notice. He said it without elaboration, and she understood she would learn the details when it was done, and that this was his way of keeping her outside the part that would be unpleasant. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. She reached out and touched the wooden box, just briefly, just the tips of her fingers against the lid. "There's something else," she said, "on the paper, the last line." "Your name," he said quietly. "My name," she looked up at him. "I've been Arabella for so long I've almost forgotten the one before it, but it's there, on the record. Harwick has it." "What is it?" he asked, and then when she hesitated, "I am going to know it soon regardless. I would rather hear it from you." She told him. He repeated it once, quietly, as though trying it for sound. Then he looked at her in that way he had, the way that had nothing to do with the name or the record or the 7 years of careful fiction, and said, "You've been Arabella to me since the moment I heard it. That doesn't require a document." She looked at him for a long moment. "Don't be unreasonably kind to me," she said. "I don't quite know how to manage it." "You'll learn," he said. They were married on a Thursday, 8 days before the date that had been announced. The ceremony was small Gerald Fitch, Charlotte Alderton, the Dowager Duchess, Edmund's oldest friend a quiet barrister named Hartley, and a vicar who had known Edmund since childhood and asked no questions that weren't strictly required by the service. The Dowager had been told the essentials the evening before. She had sat very still while Edmund told her, and when he finished she had looked at Arabella for a long moment, not the assessing look of their first meeting, but something else, something quieter. "Did you love him before or after you decided to tell him?" she asked. "Before," Arabella said, "long before." The Dowager had nodded once, and that was the end of it. The church was cold and smelled of old stone and candle wax, and the light came through the windows in long pale slants that turned the dust in the air to gold. Charlotte cried immediately and made no effort to stop. Gerald Fitch wore his good coat and polished his spectacles twice. Hartley stood beside Edmund with the expression of a man who had waited 15 years for this occasion and intended to remember every detail. Arabella stood at the altar in a dress that was not white. She had chosen a deep blue silk, the color she had worn the first night at the Pemberton Musicale, which felt like the right kind of marking, and looked at Edmund and felt something she could not name and did not try to. He looked at her throughout the entire service. Not at the vicar, not at the words, not at the ring when he placed it. At her. As though he had already attended to all the formal requirements, and this, her face, her eyes, this particular moment was the actual ceremony, the one that counted. When it was done, when the vicar had said the final words and Charlotte had produced a second handkerchief, Edmund turned to her and said quietly, so that only she could hear, "How do you feel?" She considered it genuinely. "Like myself," she said, "for the first time in a very long time." He took her hand and held it and said nothing further, which was exactly right. The week that followed was the last perfect week. She would think of it that way later, when later arrived and brought with it the mourning and the letter and the full weight of what had not yet been resolved. She would think. There was a week, after the wedding and before the storm, that was entirely and completely good. Not uncomplicated, nothing in her life had ever been uncomplicated, but good in the way that things are good when they are real, when they have been earned, when you know exactly what they cost and choose them anyway. They stayed in Edmund's house on Grosvenor Square. She learned the rooms of it, the high ceilings and the good light and the library that took up most of the east wing, and smelled of leather and old paper in a way that felt, inexplicably, like arriving somewhere. She learned his habits, the small specific ones that a person only acquires by watching, that he read in the mornings before anything else, standing up, with his coffee cooling beside him, that he was better tempered before noon than after, that he had a habit, when thinking, of tapping his forefinger twice against whatever surface was nearest, table, book, his own knee, and that she could now read from the rhythm of it, whether he was working through something solvable or something that was giving him genuine difficulty. He learned her in return. She felt it, the quiet, consistent attention of a man who had decided to understand her, and was going about it with the same thorough patience he brought to everything. She slept without the particular vigilance she had carried for 7 years, the half-wakefulness, the sense of monitoring, the readiness. She slept and woke and found the room familiar, and the person beside her known, and the wooden box on the shelf across the room where she had put it in the open, where it was simply an object rather than a secret. She did not burn the paper. Edmund had asked her, one evening in the library, whether she wanted to. She had thought about it. "Not yet," she said. He had nodded as though he understood, which she suspected he did. It was on the 6th day, a Sunday, quiet, the house reduced to its minimum staff for the morning, that she came downstairs and found Edmund in the study with the door closed. She did not think anything of it. She went to the library, found her book, made herself comfortable in the chair by the window that had already, in 6 days, become her chair. She read for perhaps 20 minutes. Then she heard Edmund's voice through the study door, not the words, just the tone, a controlled and careful tone she associated with him managing something unwelcome. Then silence. Then nothing for a long time. She told herself it was nothing, an estate matter, a letter from his solicitor about the Harwick situation, which was ongoing and being handled, and which Edmund had told her not to worry about in a tone that implied he was handling it and she could trust him to do so. She told herself this and continued to read, and did not quite manage to take in a single word for the next quarter hour. When Edmund came out of the study, he came to the library doorway and stood there for a moment. He was holding something, a letter. She could see the edge of it, and his face was arranged with extraordinary care. Too much care. She put her book down. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her across the library, her chair, her book, the morning light on her face, and something moved through his expression that she could not fully read, which was new, which frightened her more than anything that had come before it. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. And the last perfect week ended. She would remember afterward the particular quality of the light. It came through the library windows at a low angle, winter light, thin and pale and very clear, the kind that showed everything without warmth. It lay across the floor in long rectangles and caught the dust that always lived in libraries and turned it briefly, uselessly gold. She would remember thinking, in the strange slowed-down way that the mind works in moments of crisis, that it was very beautiful light, that it was entirely the wrong kind of light for what was happening. Edmund came into the room and sat down across from her, not in his usual chair, in the one nearest to her. She noticed this. She noticed everything in those first few seconds with the hyper-clarity of someone whose body has understood the situation before her mind has caught up. He put the letter on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. "Harwick moved," she said. This morning, his voice was steady. It was delivered by a private messenger, not to me, to my solicitor who brought it here directly. A pause. There are copies. He sent them to 4 other people this morning. Pemberton, my cousin Gerald, Lord and Lady Forsyth. He watched her face. And the Dowager. Arabella closed her eyes briefly, opened them. What does it contain? The birth record. Edmund's voice did not change. Annotated, with a letter from Harwick explaining its significance and its implications for, he stopped, precise, deliberate, for the validity of our marriage. The word landed in the room like something physical. He's claiming the marriage is invalid, she said. He's suggesting grounds for challenge, on the basis that you misrepresented your identity. Edmund looked at her steadily. He knows we married earlier than announced. He has been watching more closely than I accounted for. She looked at the letter. At the edge of it, the dark ink of Harwick's seal just visible. 7 years of careful construction, and it had come to this, a morning, a letter, a man who had been patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment. Is he right, she asked, about the grounds? My solicitor says it would not succeed, Edmund said. You did not misrepresent your identity to the church or to the law. The name on our marriage record is the name on your birth record, your full legal name. What you omitted from social conversation is not grounds for legal challenge. A pause. But he doesn't need to succeed legally. He only needs to create sufficient doubt, sufficient conversation. To damage you, she said. To damage us, he said. She stood up. She walked to the window, her window now, in her house, in the life she had walked into 6 days ago, and looked out at the street below where London was conducting its Sunday morning, with cheerful indifference to the letter on the table behind her. I should have told you sooner, she said. Not for the first time, not the last. Yes, he said, simply without cruelty. She turned around. He was watching her with the expression she had never been able to fully read, the one she had first seen in the library doorway a quarter of an hour ago, careful and complex, and containing something she couldn't name. Edmund, she said, say what you're thinking, all of it. A long pause. He looked at the letter, then at her. I am thinking, he said carefully, that I am angry. Not at you, I was angry at you and I worked through it, and I am not now, or not primarily. He paused. I am angry at Harwick, which is a cleaner anger and more useful. I am angry that he has turned something that was ours, that should have been private between us, into a public document, into a weapon. His voice was still even, but there was something beneath it now, something she recognized as genuine and significant feeling held under deliberate pressure. I am also thinking that I knew, when I proposed to you, that you had things you hadn't told me. I proposed anyway. That was a choice I made with clear eyes, and I will not now pretend otherwise. And the letter, she asked. He looked at it for a moment. The letter, he said, is Harwick's problem to regret, not ours. She looked at him. You say that with a great deal of certainty for a man whose mourning has just been significantly complicated. I say it with the certainty of a man who decided some time ago what mattered and intends to conduct himself accordingly. He met her gaze. Which does not mean there won't be difficulty. I told you there would be difficulty. You did, she said. I am not telling you it will be easy, he said. I am telling you it will be managed. Those are different things. She nodded slowly. Then, because she needed to ask it and there was no version of herself that could not ask it, do you wish you hadn't, any of it? Do you wish? No, he said, before she had finished. Immediate, unambiguous, the word placed with such exactness that it left no room for qualification. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said quietly. All right, he said. He left that afternoon to begin the work of it. The solicitor, the conversations that needed to be had in person, the particular careful management of narrative that a situation like this required. He kissed her forehead before he went, which was not a thing he did with any regularity, and which communicated more than most of his sentences. She spent the afternoon thinking. Not anxiously. The anxiety had burned through itself sometime in the last 2 hours, and what remained was something quieter and more functional. She sat in the library with the wooden box in her lap and thought about the shape of everything that had happened and the shape of everything still to come, and what she was, specifically, going to do about it. Because she was not, she understood clearly, a woman who waited for things to be managed on her behalf. She had spent 7 years managing things entirely alone, which had its costs, but it also built in her a capacity for action that did not simply dissolve because she was now, for the first time, not alone. She opened the box, took out the paper. Read it one more time. Then she put it in her pocket, closed the box, and went to find Gerald Fitch's address book, which she had noticed on his hall table 3 years ago and memorized because she memorized useful things. She needed to find her mother. Vivienne was not difficult to locate. She was staying in a modest set of rooms near Covent Garden, no longer Harwick's house, which meant either she had left or been asked to go, and from the expression on her face when she opened the door it was clearly the latter. She had the look of a woman who had recently been shown a consequence. Arabella came in without being invited. She sat. She put the paper on the table. Vivienne looked at it and then looked away. "He has copies," Arabella said. "I know." Vivienne's voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. "He told me what he intended to do. I told him," she stopped. "I told him it wasn't necessary, that there were other ways. He didn't listen." "He never intended to listen," Arabella said. "You were the means, Vivienne, not the partner. You understand that now." Vivienne sat very still. "Yes." "I need you to do something," Arabella said. Her mother looked up. "I need you to write down everything," Arabella said. "Everything Harwick said to you, everything he asked, everything you gave him and when and how, every conversation you can remember, every visit, every question." She paused. "My husband's solicitor will tell me whether it can be used, but I need it written and I need it today." Vivienne stared at her. "You want me to give testimony against him?" "I want you to tell the truth," Arabella said, "which I recognize is not something I've previously been able to rely on from you, but yes, that's what I want." A silence. Vivienne looked at her hands, her elegant, trained, performative hands, and something happened in her face that Arabella had seen perhaps twice in her entire life. Something unperformed. "He's dangerous," Vivienne said quietly. "I know," Arabella said. "So is my husband, with significantly better reasons." Her mother was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Covent Garden was busy with its Sunday business. Vendors, carriages, the particular noise of a city that did not stop for private crises. "Will it help him?" Vivienne asked finally. "You're the Duke." "It might," Arabella said. "I don't know yet, but it's the truth, and the truth is the only thing I have left that I haven't already tried." Another silence. Then Vivienne reached for a pen. Arabella returned to Grosvenor Square in the early evening. Edmund was not yet back. She gave the written pages to his secretary with instructions that were clear and specific and left no room for interpretation, and then she went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and was, for the first time since Sunday morning, completely still. She sat there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then she got up, went to the shelf, took down the wooden box. She carried it to the fireplace. She stood in front of it for a long time, the box in her hands, the fire warm against her face. Then she opened it, took out the paper, read it one final time, not from memory this time, but actually read it, every word, the faded parish ink in her father's name and her mother's name and her own, the one she had been given and abandoned, and was now, in some legal and essential way, fully herself again. She folded it, held the corner to the flame. This time she did not pull it back. She watched it go, not quickly, not dramatically, the paper darkening and curling and releasing into nothing with the quiet efficiency of something that has been ready for this for a long time. She held it until she had to let go, and then she let go, and then there was only ash and firelight. She put the empty box on the mantelpiece. She heard Edmund's step in the hall below, then his voice brief to his secretary, then the particular rhythm of him on the stairs, even, unhurried, without apology. He opened the bedroom door and found her standing in front of the fire. He looked at the empty box on the mantelpiece. He looked at her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She considered it carefully, the way she considered things now fully, without the old instinct to manage her own answers. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." He crossed the room and stood beside her, and they both looked at the fire for a moment. "Hartley thinks Vivienne's account is usable," he said. "Combined with what we already have on Harwick's methods, the clerk in Hertfordshire, the way the record was obtained, there's enough to pursue him through the proper channels. Quietly, but effectively." "Good," she said. "It will take some months." "I know. There will still be talk for a while." "I know that too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You went to see her, your mother?" Not a question. He had already spoken to his secretary. "Yes," she said. "You didn't tell me you were going." She looked at him. "I didn't ask your permission." A pause, then, "No, you didn't." And something in his voice, not quite amusement, but the shadow of it, told her this was not a complaint, that it was, if anything, the opposite. "I've been managing things alone for a long time," she said. We're going to have to learn how to manage them together. What that looks like." She paused. "I don't think I'll always get it right." "Nor will I," he said. "I'm told I can be unreasonably controlling about matters I consider my responsibility." "Who told you that?" "My mother on several occasions, with some emphasis." She almost smiled, almost. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." She said it simply, without the careful architecture she normally built around significant things. "For the park in the rain, for the proposal when I said no, for all of it." He turned to look at her. His expression was the open one, the one she had first seen and hoped she would spend her life seeing, and was now beginning to believe she might. "Don't thank me," he said. "I acted entirely in my own interest." "That's not true." "Largely in my own interest," he amended. "The overlap with yours was convenient." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had been very careful not to do in all the months of careful management and controlled feeling. She laughed. Genuinely, without performance, without thinking about how it sounded or what it communicated. Edmund looked at her with an expression she had never seen before and could not name. "There," he said quietly, as though he had been waiting for it for a long time. The talk lasted 6 weeks. Arabella had braced for longer. She had prepared herself in the methodical way she prepared for most things, for a sustained campaign, the averted gazes, the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, the particular social cruelty of women who had smiled at her face for 2 years and would now find reasons to look elsewhere. She had been through versions of this before, smaller ones, in the years of building herself, and she knew its texture and its duration, and the specific effort it required to walk through it without showing that it cost anything. What she had not prepared for was Edmund. Not Edmund's position, not his title, not the cold social mathematics of what it meant to have the Duke of Ashford stand visibly and consistently beside you during a period of public difficulty. Though those things were real, and she was not naive enough to pretend they weren't. What she had not prepared for was Edmund himself, the specific, unglamorous, daily reality of him. He did not protect her from the talk. He had asked her early on, whether she wanted him to, and she had said no, and he had accepted this without argument because he understood, she thought, that she had not survived 7 years of complete solitude to become a woman who needed shielding. What he did instead was something she found, consistently and somewhat to her own surprise, more valuable. He simply refused to treat the situation as though it were shameful. He brought her to his club's public rooms on a Tuesday and introduced her to 2 men whose opinions carried weight, not with any visible defiance but with the ordinary ease of a man introducing his wife. He attended a dinner at which he knew the topic would arise and sat beside her, and listened to the conversation, and responded to the pointed remarks with such measured, impersonal accuracy that the men making them found, somehow, that they had agreed to positions they had not intended to hold. He wrote letters. She did not see them all, but she saw some, to Pemberton, to his cousin Gerald, to the Forsyths, and they were the most precise and surgical pieces of writing she had ever read. Not angry, not defensive, simply factual, with the particular quality of a man who has all the facts and is prepared to deploy them in any order necessary. Hartley managed the legal dimension. There were meetings she was not present for and documents she was not shown until they were settled, and she made her peace with this, not because Edmund required it, but because she understood that there were things he was better positioned to do, and that partnership, real partnership, meant knowing which battles were hers. Harwick's name began to appear in certain conversations, in certain ledgers, in a light that was not flattering. It happened quietly. It happened with the particular efficiency of a man who had been paying attention for years and knew exactly where to apply pressure. Edmund never told her the full details. She never asked for them. She knew they would come in time when they were settled, and that in the meantime the results were visible and sufficient. The Dowager came to tea on a Thursday in the 3rd week. Arabella had prepared herself for this too, in the way she had prepared for things her whole life, thoroughly, practically, with no illusions. She had dressed carefully, chosen a room with good light, arranged the tea with the specific attention to detail that the Dowager would notice and appreciate. She had thought about what she would say if asked directly and decided, this time, she would say exactly what she thought and accept the consequences. The Dowager arrived precisely on time, accepted tea, and looked around the room with the assessing gaze that Arabella now recognized as her natural mode of engagement with the world. Then she said, "Edmund tells me you went to see your mother." "Yes," Arabella said. "To ask her to provide testimony." "Yes." The Dowager considered this for a moment. "And did she?" "She did." Another pause. That must have been difficult, to ask her for something after everything. Arabella looked at her. It was necessary. Difficult and necessary aren't always the same thing. The Dowager looked back at her. Something shifted in her expression, not the assessing look, and not the warmer look of their first meeting, but something that combined both and added something new. "Edmund's father," she said, "was a man who found it very difficult to ask for anything from anyone. He considered it a weakness." She picked up her cup. "He was wrong, of course. The inability to ask is simply a different kind of weakness and considerably less useful." A pause. "Edmund is better at it than his father was. He asked you to marry him, which cost him something, and you went to your mother, which cost you something. I find I approve of people who do difficult things at some cost to themselves." Arabella looked at her steadily. "You're not going to ask me to justify anything." "I was Edmund's mother before I was the Dowager Duchess," she said. "I know my son. I know what he is and what he requires and what he will not tolerate." She set down her cup. "He chose you with complete knowledge of himself and sufficient knowledge of you to make it a real choice. That is all I needed to know." A pause, precise. "The rest is simply weather. It passes." Arabella held her gaze for a moment. Then she said something she had not planned to say, that came from somewhere unmanaged. "I intend to deserve it. The choice. His and yours." The Dowager looked at her for a long moment. "My dear," she said quietly, "I believe you already do." The sixth week brought two things in the same afternoon. The first was a letter from Vivienne. It was short, barely a page, in her mother's theatrical hand that had not changed in 30 years. She wrote that she was leaving London, that she had accepted an offer from a cousin in Edinburgh. Whether this was true or invented, Arabella suspected she would never know, and that she was going quietly and would not trouble either of them again. She did not apologize. Arabella had not expected her to. Apology required a kind of self-examination that Vivienne had never been capable of and probably never would be. She did write at the end, two sentences that Arabella read 3 times. "You have become something I could not have made you. I want you to know I understand the difference." Arabella sat with the letter for a long time. She did not feel what she might have expected. Not the old anger, not the complicated grief, not the specific bitterness of a woman who had wanted a different mother and had long since stopped expecting one. She felt instead something quieter than any of that, something that had to do with completion, with a chapter that had been left unfinished for a very long time arriving, imperfectly and late and without sufficient resolution, at something that was at least an ending. She put the letter away, not in the wooden box that was empty now, and she had decided it would stay empty, in a drawer, somewhere accessible if she ever wanted it and ignorable if she didn't. The second thing that afternoon was Edmund, returning from a meeting with Hartley with a specific quality of stillness that she had learned meant something had been concluded. He came to the library, her room, their room, the one with the chair by the window that was hers by habit and his by occasional incursion, and sat down and looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the territory adjacent to one. "Harwick," she said. "Has agreed," Edmund said, "to a private settlement that will significantly curtail his ability to conduct certain business activities in London for the foreseeable future, in exchange for our decision not to pursue the matter of the clerk in Hertfordshire through the courts." She looked at him. "Is that sufficient?" "It removes his leverage entirely and limits his options considerably," Edmund said. "It is not everything I would have wanted. It is everything that was practical." He paused. "He will not bother us again. I am confident of that." "How confident?" "Completely," he said, in the tone he used when he meant it absolutely. She nodded slowly. "And the records?" she asked. "His copies have been returned as a condition of the settlement. What circulates already," Edmund paused, "cannot be uncirculated, but context has been provided in the appropriate quarters, and the interest has largely run its course." He looked at her steadily. "It will always be known by some people who you were before. I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," she said. "It will not always be comfortable." "I've never been particularly interested in comfortable," she said. "I've been interested in real." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I know." It was Charlotte who said, at dinner 6 weeks after the wedding, the thing that Arabella had been thinking and not saying. "You're different." They were sitting in the small dining room at Grosvenor Square, just the two of them. Charlotte had become a regular and unremarkable presence in the house, which Edmund tolerated with the air of a man who had decided certain things were not worth objecting to. He had excused himself after the main course to deal with a correspondence matter, and they were alone with the remains of the meal and the candlelight and the comfortable silence of women who had known each other long enough not to require noise. "Different how?" Arabella asked. Charlotte looked at her thoughtfully. "Less," she paused, searching, "less like someone who might leave at any moment." Arabella looked at the candle. It was true. She had noticed it herself, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but accumulating over 6 weeks in small, specific ways. She no longer assessed rooms when she entered them. Not the doors, not the exits, not the positions of people relative to her. She sat in chairs with her back to the wall sometimes and did not notice until afterward. She said things, actual things, unmanaged things in company, and felt the slight shock of having said them, and then the absence of consequence and the slow, ongoing recalibration of a woman learning that honesty was not, in fact, structurally dangerous. She still noticed things. She suspected she always would: the attention, the reading of rooms and faces and subtexts, the capacity for that particular kind of seeing that years of necessary vigilance had built in her. But it was different now. It was a choice rather than a requirement, a skill rather than a survival mechanism. She was, she thought, something she had not been since she was very young and perhaps had never been in any adult form, simply herself, in a room, without the careful distance between the woman she was and the woman she was presenting. "Yes," she said to Charlotte, "I suppose I am." Charlotte smiled at her, the warm, uncomplicated smile that had been one of the reliable goods of the past 3 years. "It suits you," she said, "enormously." Edmund came back from his letters and found them talking about something else entirely, and sat down and accepted more wine, and listened with the expression of a man who found this pleasant and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Later, after Charlotte had gone and the house had settled into its evening quiet, they sat together in the library, Arabella in her chair, Edmund in his, a fire going and books open that neither of them were actively reading. And it was so ordinary, so specifically and completely ordinary, that she stopped reading her sentence and looked up. Edmund looked up at the same moment. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. She paused. "I was thinking that this is what I wanted when I was 17 and leaving. I didn't have words for it then, but this is it. This specific." She looked around the room, at the fire and the books and the chair that was hers and the man across from her who knew her name, her real name, and had chosen her anyway and was sitting here on an ordinary evening reading a book. This. Edmund looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, quietly, simply, as though she had said something that required no elaboration because he understood it exactly. "It is." She looked back at her book. Outside, London conducted its business. The fire shifted. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. She read her sentence. This time she took it in. 1 year later. It was a Tuesday in October when she found it. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for a letter she half remembered receiving in the autumn of the previous year, something about an estate matter in Shropshire that Edmund's solicitor had wanted her to review, and that she had filed somewhere sensible and now could not locate. She had been working through the lower drawer of the writing desk in the morning room when her hand found, at the very back, the corner of something that was not a letter. It was a piece of paper, folded once. She sat back and held it and knew, before she opened it, what it was. Not the birth record that was ash, had been ash for nearly a year, and she had not regretted it once. This was something else, something she had forgotten she had kept. She unfolded it. It was a list, written in her own hand, in the small, precise script she had used in her early years in London, before her handwriting had relaxed into something less controlled. Dated October 1815, her first month in the city. At the top, underlined twice, "What I require." Below it, in the careful enumeration of a 17-year-old who had decided to be systematic about survival. "A name that holds, a room of my own, enough money not to be afraid, someone who does not require me to be less than I am, a life I have chosen rather than fallen into." She sat with it for a long time. Then she heard Edmund's step in the hall, that particular even rhythm she could identify anywhere in the house now, that she had come to know the way you know things that have become part of the structure of your days, and she looked at the list once more. He came to the morning room doorway and found her at the desk, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she was not working. "What have you got?" he asked. She held it out. He crossed the room and took it and read it, and she watched his face while he did, the slight shift in his expression as he understood what it was, the particular stillness of a man reading something that mattered. He was quiet for a moment when he finished. October 1815, he said. My first month here. He looked at the list again, then at her. All of them, he said. She knew what he meant. She had been sitting here thinking the same thing. All of them, she agreed. He folded it once along the original crease and held it out to her, not putting it down on the desk, putting it in her hand specifically with intention. Keep it, he said. I was thinking of burning it, she said. I don't need it anymore. No, he said, but you made it when you were 17 years old and alone, and entirely without reason to believe any of it was possible. He looked at her steadily. That seems worth keeping. She looked down at the paper in her hand, at the careful underlined words of a girl who had been very young and very afraid, and had made a list anyway because making a list was a way of believing that the things on it could exist. She folded it and put it in her pocket. Come and look at something, Edmund said. She followed him down the hall and through the east wing and into the library, where the morning light was coming through the tall windows in the way it did at this hour, clean and level and entirely without sentiment. And he stopped in the middle of the room and turned to look at her with an expression she had been seeing for a year now and still could not fully account for. The one that made her feel, consistently and without warning, as though she had arrived somewhere after a very long journey. I had something moved, he said. She looked where he was looking. On the shelf beside the fireplace, between two volumes of legal history, was the wooden box. Empty, lid closed, sitting in the morning light as though it had always been there. She looked at it for a moment. I found it in the storage room, Edmund said. I thought it should be somewhere you could see it. It's empty, she said. Yes, he said. That seemed like the right reason to display it. She crossed the room and touched it, just the lid, just her fingertips, the way she had touched it 1,000 times before in a locked room in another house in another life. It felt the same, small and wooden and ordinary, an object. Just an object now. She turned around. Edmund was watching her with the morning light behind him and the library around him, and the house quiet in the way it was quiet on weekday mornings, when it was just the two of them and London did its business outside, and in here there was simply this. Next October, she said, will be 10 years since I came to London. I know, he said. He had looked up the date some months ago, for reasons he had not fully explained and she had not pressed. I arrived on a Tuesday, she said. Also like today. She looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the familiar specific reality of him, the man who had read her list and said all of them and meant it without ceremony or elaboration, because that was how he meant things. Edmund, she said. Yes. She did not have a particular thing to say. She had simply wanted to say his name in this room on this morning, in the way she said it now, not as the title, not as the careful social address, not as anything other than the name of a person who was known to her completely and who knew her in return. He looked at her for a moment. Then he did what he sometimes did in the library in the mornings, in the specific quiet of their ordinary life. He held out his hand. She took it. Outside, London went about its October business. The light moved. Somewhere in the house, a clock marked the hour. The box sat on the shelf in the morning light, empty and open to view, keeping nothing. It had done its work. So had she.